So right after the Russian Revolution of 1917, communism becomes the source of fear for the Western world. And the West was very, very suspicious of what the Soviet Union was up to. Now, the rise of Nazism is between World War I and World War II, and this makes communists and the Western democratic powers put their differences aside for a little while and work together to stamp out the Nazis. But at the end of the day, at the end of the Second World War, the conflict between capitalism and communism really comes to the forefront. And this conflict lasts from the end of World War II until the fall of communism in 1991. And this is known as the Cold War. After World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the world's two biggest superpowers. The first conflict between the two superpowers was in Eastern Europe. Following the Second World War, the Soviet Union insisted that they should be in control of Eastern Europe after it had been freed from the Nazis, whereas the West wanted to turn these countries into Western and capitalist democracies. These countries do fall under the control of the communists, and you have a situation in Europe where Western Europe is capitalist democracies and Eastern Europe are a series of communist dictatorships. And a metaphor that's used for this is the Iron Curtain. There's an Iron Curtain dividing Eastern and Western Europe, with communists on one side and capitalists on the other side. Germany was divided into East Germany and West Germany, and the German city of Berlin was divided into East and West by a wall that ran through the city. So, right after World War I, there was conflict between communism and capitalism in Europe. Not long after, this conflict presented itself in Asia. During World War II, Korea had been conquered by the Japanese. When North Korea was liberated, it was divided into two countries, North Korea and South Korea. North Korea came under the control of the communist world, while South Korea came under control of the Western capitalist world. In 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. Communist China comes to the help of the North Koreans. The United States come to the help of the South Koreans. The war ends in a standoff, leaving Korea divided into North and South. This is the way it is today. Vietnam was a country that had a long colonial past. During World War II, Vietnam had been conquered by the Japanese. Before the Japanese, Vietnam, along with Cambodia and Laos, were French colonies. A homegrown nationalist communist movement emerged in Vietnam under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. After World War II, the French re-established themselves in Vietnam, but this was short-lived and the Vietnamese were able to fight them off. Vietnam was divided into North and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was communist, and South Vietnam was under control of the United States. An agreement had been made that there would be democratic elections to unify the country. The communists in North Vietnam were quite popular in Vietnam. The regime of the United States was despised. So if there was an election in Vietnam, Vietnam would have been reunited as a communist country. Americans came in to stop the elections from happening. For Americans, if the communists won in Vietnam, it would lead to more communist expansion in Asia, something that they weren't willing to let happen. So this doesn't bode well for Americans either. It's showing really that they're willing to stamp out democracy as long as it means stamping out communism. Either way, Vietnam goes on to win the war and will go on to unite the country under communist control. In Afghanistan, a communist party comes to power in 1978, and this party, like in Vietnam, was a homegrown communist movement. Soviet leaders were excited to see the expansion of communism to the south. Now, Afghanistan is an extremely conservative country, and there are conflicts between communism and conservative element in Afghanistan. Communism is very anti-religious. Afghanistan is very Muslim. Communism called for the liberation of women in Afghanistan. So conflicts between communist ideology and conservative Afghanistan led to a lot of conflict. The Soviets feared that the communist state in Afghanistan was going to be overthrown by Islamic groups. So the Soviet Union gets involved in Afghanistan, and the Soviet-Afghan wars fought between the years 1979 and 1989, and it's fair to compare the war between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan between the war between Vietnam and the United States. During the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union and China were pumping money into North Vietnam to help them fight the Americans. During the war in Afghanistan, the United States was giving money to the Afghan rebels who were fighting the Soviet Union. So both Vietnam and Afghanistan are examples of the two superpowers, United States and the Soviet Union, failing to control a smaller, much less powerful country. In Cuba, Fidel Castro comes to power in 1959, and the government that Castro overthrew was corrupt. They were supported by the United States, and there were a lot of American companies in Cuba when Castro took over. When Castro took over, he nationalized all of the American-owned companies. The U.S. was very angry at this. The United States was making a lot of money in Cuba, and Castro kicked them out. So there's a lot of anger, and U.S. efforts were made to overthrow Castro. This ultimately made Castro become closer friends with the Soviet Union, and at this point Castro really started to think of himself as a Marxist revolutionary. The leader of the Soviet Union in 1959 was Nikita Khrushchev, and he would lead the Communist Party after the death of Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev gives Cuba nuclear missiles to keep the United States out of the country. The United States discover the missiles in 1962, and this sets off a tense standoff between the United States and Cuba, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a time of heightened fear in the United States, fear of a nuclear attack from Cuba. Eventually, American President John F. Kennedy and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev resolved the problem without any nuclear weapons being used. The nuclear missiles were removed from Cuba, and the United States agreed not to invade Cuba. But this Cuban Missile Crisis exemplifies really the most dangerous aspect of the Cold War, and that was the arms race in nuclear weapons. At the end of World War II, there was one country that had nuclear weapons, and that was the United States, and they used these nuclear weapons against Japan. After the war, the Soviet Union wanted in on this technology. If there's only one power with nuclear capabilities, then the threat is that they'll take over the world and just be completely dominant. So the Soviet Union worked at it, and they managed to produce their own nuclear weapons by 1949. In the decades following the Cold War, during the Cold War, there were enough weapons in the world to destroy the world many times over. The first time in history where a single bomb could really obliterate any city in the world. This was pretty scary stuff, and scientists were seriously talking about the possibility that human beings could end up causing their own extinction. And just knowing this, knowing that there were weapons destructive enough to destroy the entire world, was probably the main reason why a war didn't break out directly between the United States and the USSR. So it's like a balance of power. In the two world wars, people were surprised at how destructive technology could be. People were a lot more aware of this now. Both sides knew that a nuclear war wouldn't benefit anyone, so they avoided provoking each other too much. At the same time, they continued to build up their weapons. So there was no real war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it was fought in these smaller conflicts all around the globe. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Those are all examples of this.